This past Sunday, the Catholic Church celebrated the feast of Christ the King. Although the title of King and similar terms, such as Lord or Most High, were applied to Christ as early as biblical times, this feast day wasn't established until 1925, during the reign of Pope Pius XI. In the current liturgical rubrics of the Catholic Church, the Feast of Christ the King is celebrated in the last Sunday before Advent, thus placing it in late November. Yet prior to the late 1960s, the Feast of Christ the King was actually celebrated on the last Sunday of October. Some Catholic commentators have criticized this change, stating that placing the Feast of Christ the King at the end of the liturgical year creates the mentality that the Kingship of Christ is something that will only be established in the end times. To some degree, there's a certain amount of truth to this criticism. In Advent and the Christmas season, we celebrate the birth of Jesus. In Lent and the Easter season, we celebrate the death and resurrection of Jesus. The general flow of the liturgical calendar is based on the life of Christ. It's easy to thus fall into the belief that the Kingship of Christ is something that will only come about in the end times, as if it's the last thing that Christ will ever bring about. It's the final stage of his mission. There are some Christians who interpret the kingdom of God in earthly terms, believing that the reign of Christ is something that is manifested primarily in physical, tangible, or earthly terms. For example, there is an entire school of thought within Christian eschatology, mostly popular within evangelical circles, that states that the Jews will be brought back to the Holy Land, and when this happens, the kingdom of Israel, as it existed in biblical times, will be re-established, with Christ as its visible earthly head. This is not in line with the Catholic view of the end times, nor is it an idea that is generally accepted among the average everyday Catholic. But it is an opinion that exists out there in the Christian world. And like with all theological errors, it is something that must be guarded against. Nonetheless, this isn't a view that is necessitated in the post-Vatican II liturgical rubrics. Rather, in the current liturgical rubrics used by the Catholic Church, the past elements and the future elements of God's plan of salvation seem to be equally emphasized. In the collect prayer, for example, said at the beginning of Mass, the priest or bishop presiding over the Mass says, quote, "Almighty and ever-living God, whose will it is to restore all things in your beloved Son, the King of the universe, grant, we pray, that the whole of creation, set free from slavery, may render your majesty service and ceaselessly proclaim your praise." Here you see an emphasis on the fact that Christ restores all of creation to its original goodness. He purifies creation, and this is something that will only be actualized in the end times. Yet implicit to this is also the view that the restoration of creation is but the most final manifestation of Christ's kingship. Humanity was set free from sin, and even in the here and now, those who accept God's plan of salvation are given the strength to offer to God the honor and praise that he deserves. And it is through this that we are admitted into or become members of God's kingdom. Everything up until the end times is merely a playing out of what God started on the cross. In the preface to the canon, the one presiding over the liturgy says, quote, "By offering himself on the altar of the cross as a spotless sacrifice to bring us peace, Christ might accomplish the mysteries of human redemption, and making all created things subject to his rule, he might present to the immensity of your majesty an eternal and universal kingdom, a kingdom of truth and life, a kingdom of holiness and grace, a kingdom of justice and peace." Unquote. Sin is both alienation from God as well as a state of rebellion against God. Therefore, by redeeming mankind from sin, Christ subjected all things to himself, something which was accomplished on the cross and is continuing to unfold throughout all of human history. There are two tendencies in the Church. One of over-spiritualizing the kingship of Christ, another of treating Christianity as nothing more than a social or political platform with vague religious or spiritual undertones. The latter is found among some Christian theologians and commentators who are actively involved in the culture wars. On the other hand, one would seem to be led to the former view if they read the liturgical texts of this feast without examining it in its proper context. Both of these tendencies undermine what could be called the multidimensional nature of the kingship of Christ. In the document Quas Primas, in which he established the feast of Christ the King, Pope Pius XI states that Christ is king in a figurative or metaphorical sense. Jesus, as God incarnate, is the source of all truth, and serves as the ultimate example of how we should and must live our lives. Thus, Christ reigns in the hearts, the minds, and the wills of his followers. Yet Pope Pius goes on to say that Christ is king not only in a figurative sense, but also in a literal sense as well. Christ is the second person in the Trinity, and is therefore equally God along with the Father. All of the authority of the Father is found in the Son. In fact, this is the radical claim of Christianity. Jesus was both God and human, and as a result, Jesus is the only human in whom the fullness of divine authority rests. Now, God has absolute authority over all creation. There is no authority, whether religious or secular, whether spiritual or political, higher than that of God. And thus Jesus, as God in human form, is the most direct or definitive expression of this authority. The Catholic Church has a very systematic and well thought out system of social and political doctrines. While I would be wary of oversimplifying Catholic social and moral thought, and in fact I hope to examine all of the details and nuances of Catholic social thought and the political, economic, and moral implications of this in future videos, I think it is safe to say that all of Catholic social and political thought proceeds from the principle that I mentioned above. That is to say, the creation of a truly just society presupposes the acknowledgement of the authority that Christ has in all things, even in the social and political realms. This is known as the social kingship of Christ. None of this means that the Catholic Church believes in theocracy or the forced conversion of non-believers. Rather, the Catholic Church believes that the teachings and example of Christ and the graces we receive through his mediation are not only the best way, but are in fact the only way to attain holiness and virtue. Yet, this is not only the case with what we do in private, but is also something that influences our interactions with others. And what is society? other than a playing out of the interactions between individuals on a large-scale level. The standard of justice is Jesus Christ. Society, or the government, thus must use as the ethical first principles of their organization and laws the teachings of Christ and His Church. Pope Pius XI states as much in Quas Primas, wherein he teaches that the only way to attain true liberty and peace in society is by the recognition of the social kingship of Christ, both among individuals and among societies. One of the best-known symbols of this in practice is the Cresteros. In the early 20th century, a revolutionary movement began to take root in Mexico and eventually rebelled against the government. They took control of the government in 1917 and reorganized the government according to principles derived from socialism and Freemasonry. This included the creation of an entirely new constitution. This new constitution included several anti-clerical sections, which were used to justify a series of new laws made by the government, including, but not limited to, the declaring of all church property to be the property of the state, not allowing priests to publicly celebrate Mass, outlawing the taking of religious vows, prohibiting the clergy from expressing opinions on politics, both in private and in public, and deporting all foreign clergymen living in Mexico. These laws weren't always enforced, and when they were enforced, they weren't always enforced with equal degrees of strictness throughout the various provinces of Mexico. This all changed in 1926, when the President of Mexico, Plutarco Elias Calles, passed a series of laws that attempted to ensure that the anti-clerical statutes of the Mexican Constitution were enforced. People who violated or failed to enforce these rules were subject to sanctions. This resulted in the bishops suspending all masses in Mexico. Many priests were forced to abandon their churches, and all but 3 of Mexico's bishops left the country, with the only 3 remaining Catholic bishops in Mexico going into hiding. Many Catholic priests would travel from place to place covertly, attempting to celebrate Mass and administer the sacraments in secret. Those who were caught were subject to a variety of penalties, including fines, jail time, or even torture and execution. Eventually, a group of middle-class Catholic intellectuals in Mexico formed an organization known as the National League for the Defense of Religious Liberty, which produced literature advocating for constitutional reform, and often held protests in the form of boycotting government services. This caused enough of an inconvenience for the social and political elites in Mexico to complain to the government, who then sent the police to suppress these peaceful protests. Many thus felt that all peaceful means had been tried and proven not to work, and thus, starting in 1927, groups of Mexican citizens, mainly among the peasant classes in western and central Mexico, began to take up arms and hold armed rebellions against the government. These militia groups were known as Cresteros, whose name means roughly those who are of Christ in the Mexican dialect of Spanish. Now, since most of the Cresteros came from the peasant classes, they didn't have much money, and thus they couldn't afford advanced weaponry. Yet they were persistent, and as a result, the government of Mexico had to spend large amounts of money and resources to try to counteract them. In fact, the government was spending so much time, money, and resources attempting to suppress the Cresteros that they almost gave in to the demands of the Cristero rebellion. Unfortunately, the Cresteros ultimately lost, though many decades later, the anti-clerical laws of the socialist government of Mexico were reversed. The official motto of the Cresteros was Viva Cristo Rey, which in Spanish means Long Live Christ the King. Although not all attempts to fight against injustice necessitate the use of violence, and in fact the Catholic Church states that violence can only be used as a form of self-defense as a last resort, the battle of the Cresteros against the secularist government represents, in an exaggerated form, a fundamental element of human history, namely that everything is a battle between Christ and Antichrist. What that means is that, unlike with many other things in life, which require nuance, and often include gray areas, and do not always fit into neat binaries, the only two options in one's spiritual life are that they are either for Christ or against Christ. We cannot, in the spiritual realm, take a neutral middle ground. And this is where the spiritual and the social elements of the Kingship of Christ meet. Our salvation was won for us on the cross. It was thus there that the Kingship of Christ was established. We enter into the kingdom of Christ through accepting the effects of Christ's saving mission through grace. When we receive grace, we are united to Christ, and thus we are spiritually and morally transformed. Thus, how we view things, how we view ourselves, how we view God, how we view the world around us, and how we view the relationship between these things undergoes a radical change, and therefore how we live our life undergoes a radical change. We will find ourselves pursuing holiness and virtue with a greater degree of fervor. If our lives have been radically transformed by Christ, if we take seriously the following of the example of Christ, if we have actually submitted to the authority of Christ, then we will fight against anything that serves as an obstacle to the Kingship of Christ, whether within ourselves or within society. It is not uncommon for priests giving sermons on this feast day to ask the question, "Is Christ the King of your heart?" A lot of people say that and then end there. Although this is born out of the tendency to focus on the spiritual elements of Christ's reign and ignore the social elements, those who have truly allowed Christ to reign in their hearts don't see the Kingship of Christ as merely a personal thing. They don't have this attitude of, well, Christ is the highest authority for me personally, but that's just my personal subjective opinion. If Christ's kingship only applies to the realm of subjective spiritual sentiments, then he is no king at all. It is true that for the gospel reading for this week, which speaks of the trial of Jesus according to the Gospel of John, Jesus says, and I quote, "My kingdom is not of this world." What this means is that the kingdom of Christ is not merely another human political entity among many. It infinitely transcends all human or earthly authorities. Yet it transcends all earthly or human authorities precisely because it is the highest authority. It is that authority from which all lesser authorities derive their power. Let me end with a brief meditation. The Kingship of Christ is primarily spiritual and moral in nature. Yet it is for this reason that the Kingship of Christ cannot be limited merely to the spiritual and moral parts of human life, but rather permeates every part of human life. Because Christ defeated sin on the cross, for us to accept Christ means for us to strive against and overcome all that is opposed to Christ or in rebellion against God, whether it is within ourselves or within the wider society.